Hello, my name is Adrian Harrington, 42 years old. I am a colonel in the United States Air Force, set to officially become a major general in just a few weeks. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, into a family often referred to as an empire. Landmark Holdings, the largest real estate conglomerate in the state, led by my father, Edmund Harrington. But if you think I grew up in luxury, cherished and pampered like the children of a powerful family, you'd be mistaken. I was an outsider, a discordant note in the grandiose symphony of the Harrington household. And this story perhaps begins with the days I realized I didn't belong in the world I was born into. I am the second of 4 siblings. Above me is my older brother James, and below me are my 2 younger sisters, Charlotte and Evelyn. To the outside world, we were the lucky ones born with the Harrington name, synonymous with wealth, power, and privilege. But the truth wasn't always as dazzling as the chandeliers at the lavish parties my father hosted. For me, the Harrington name wasn't a crown. It was a shadow, cold and heavy, weighing on every breath I took from a young age. I remember the evenings in our grand house where ebony-paneled walls and Persian rugs told tales of wealth. My father, a tall man with piercing eyes, would sit at the head of the dining table recounting multi-million-dollar deals he'd just closed or prime real estate Landmark had acquired. James, with a smug smile, would chime in, adding a few remarks to curry favor with father. Charlotte and Evelyn, though young, knew how to nod along, feigning excitement over numbers and plans they barely understood. And me? I sat there quietly clutching a book about airplanes or a scrap of paper where I'd scribbled crude drawings of F-16s. I didn't belong in my father's world of business. What I wanted was to soar freely in the vast sky. Being a soldier is for those who settle for mediocrity with no ambition, my father once said, his voice as cold as an October wind. I was 12 the first time I heard those words, eagerly sharing my dream of becoming a pilot. I thought he was joking, the way fathers sometimes tease their kids to push them harder. But his eyes, devoid of warmth or encouragement, told me it wasn't a joke. James laughed loudly, Charlotte giggled, and Evelyn, the youngest, just looked at me with curious eyes. My mother, the only one who seemed to understand me, placed a hand on my shoulder but said nothing. She never dared to speak up in front of father. From then on, I learned to keep my dreams to myself. I stopped talking about airplanes or the military strategy books I borrowed from the library. I stopped trying to make my father see me. But I never stopped dreaming. I devoured everything I could about aviation, from the history of fighter squadrons to how a plane could navigate a storm. I secretly watched documentaries about the U.S. Air Force on the small TV in the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Rosa, the only person in the house who didn't treat me like I was superfluous. Mrs. Rosa was a rare light in those days. She was our longtime housekeeper with calloused hands and a warm smile. "Adrian," she'd often say, "your heart belongs to the sky. Don't let anyone pull you back to the ground." She was the only one who listened to me talk about my dreams, about the times I lay on the grass behind the house, watching planes streak white trails across the sky and imagining myself at the controls. Mrs. Rosa never laughed at me or told me I wasn't good enough. But beyond her, no one in my family saw value in what I loved. James, my older brother, was a perfect replica of our father, sharp, clever, and fiercely ambitious. He studied economics at an Ivy League school, with father footing the bill, buying him a luxurious apartment near campus and a BMW to keep up appearances. Charlotte and Evelyn were no different. They were sent to prestigious schools, gifted expensive dresses and European vacations. Every time they achieved something, even something as small as a high-scoring essay, father would publicly praise them as if it were a monumental victory. "That's the Harrington blood," he'd say, his eyes gleaming with pride. But for me, he never looked my way for more than a few seconds. I wasn't jealous of my siblings, at least not in the way people might think. I didn't want the cars or the lavish parties. I just wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged, even once. I wanted my father to look at me and say, "Adrian, you've done well." But that never happened. Instead, I got head shakes and veiled remarks about how I was wasting my potential or choosing a path unworthy of the family. Each time I felt myself shrink as if I were a smudge of ink on the Harringtons' perfect canvas. At 16, I knew I had to forge my own path. I spent hours in the library researching scholarships and Air Force training programs. I worked part-time at an auto repair shop to afford test prep books. I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother, because I feared she'd worry, or worse, tell father. Then one spring day, when azaleas and magnolias bloomed across Charleston, I received a letter from the U.S. Air Force Academy. A full scholarship. I had done it. I had opened a door that no one in my family thought I could even touch. The day I left home, I still hoped for something. A hug from father, a good luck wish from James, or even a wave from Charlotte and Evelyn. But as I dragged my suitcase to the gate, only my mother and Mrs. Rosa were there. Mother hugged me tightly, tears silently falling on my shoulder. "You're my pride," she whispered, her voice choked. Mrs. Rosa handed me a box of homemade cookies, smiled, and said, "Fly high, young man." Father didn't come to see me off. James was at the company office, and Charlotte and Evelyn were busy shopping. I boarded the bus, watching the grand house fade through the window, and told myself I wouldn't look back. From then on, I cut contact with my family, except for the letters I sent to my mother each year on her birthday. They were short, just a few lines about my life, flight training, long days at the academy. I never mentioned the struggles, the sleepless nights studying, or the times I wondered if I had the strength to keep going. I didn't want her to worry, and more importantly, I didn't want her to think I was seeking pity. I had chosen this path, and I would see it through, even if I had to do it alone. The Air Force Academy was the greatest challenge I'd ever faced. The early days felt like being thrown into a storm. Waking up at 5 a.m., running in the cold rain, studying subjects like aerodynamics and military strategy, all demanding absolute focus. There were moments I wanted to give up, when my hands trembled from exhaustion, when my father's words echoed in my mind, "You're not good enough." But each time I thought of my mother's eyes, Mrs. Rosa's smile, and told myself, I have to do this, not for them, but for me. The first months at the Air Force Academy were an unrelenting battle, not only with the grueling curriculum, but also with myself. I wasn't the smartest in the classroom or the strongest on the training field. Many of the other cadets, raised in military families, seemed born for this place. They knew how to stand tall, bark commands, and stay composed when instructors screamed in their faces. And me? I was the boy from Charleston, raised in rooms filled with Persian rugs, where discipline was a foreign word in my father's dictionary. But that very unfamiliarity taught me one thing. If I wanted to survive, I had to forge myself day by day, hour by hour. Every morning when the shrill wake-up siren pierced the dormitory, a part of me wanted to stay in bed, to escape the endless runs or the tests that left my mind spinning. But I didn't allow myself to stop. I remembered my father's disappointed looks, James's head shakes, and the silence of Charlotte and Evelyn. I didn't want to prove anything to them, but I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't the mediocre soldier my father had called me. I pushed myself to run faster, study later, and ask questions in class, even when I feared my answers might make me look foolish. Slowly, I realized that perseverance wasn't just an option. It was the only way I could survive. I graduated from the Air Force Academy in the top 10 of my class, an achievement I wouldn't have dared to dream of in those early days. On graduation day, standing under the blazing sun in Colorado Springs, I watched the American flag flutter over the parade ground. I didn't look for my mother or anyone from my family in the crowd. I knew they wouldn't be there. But as I held my diploma, I felt a quiet pride that didn't need anyone's validation. For the first time, I understood that I didn't need the Harrington legacy to feel my own worth. After graduation, I was assigned to a fighter squadron at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. The first time I sat in the cockpit of an F-16, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The engine roared, the vibrations coursed through the seat, and when I pulled the stick, the sensation of the plane lifting off the ground felt like I was breaking free, not just from gravity, but from my family's shadow, the mocking words, and the years I felt I wasn't enough. The sky was where I belonged, where no one could tell me I didn't deserve to be. But the sky wasn't always peaceful. In 2008, I was deployed to the Middle East, flying combat missions in Iraq. Those missions were unlike any training at the academy. Every takeoff carried the knowledge that any mistake could be my last. I remember one night when my squadron was tasked with supporting an ambushed infantry unit in a remote valley. The sky was pitch black, lit only by flashes of ground fire. I had to navigate the F-16 through treacherous mountains while the urgent voice of the ground commander crackled over the radio. "They're overwhelming us. We need you now." There was no time for fear. I locked onto the target, dropped laser-guided bombs, and prayed I'd done it right. When the radio crackled back, "Target destroyed, you saved us," I finally exhaled. That night, back at the base, I sat alone in my room, hands still trembling. Not from the danger, but from the realization that I'd just been responsible for dozens of lives. That was when I understood that being a soldier wasn't just about flying. It was about carrying burdens my family could never imagine. My years in the Middle East forged me into a different person. I learned to stay calm under pressure, make split-second decisions, and face fear without letting it control me. I was awarded the Silver Star after a mission where I led my squadron through heavy anti-aircraft fire to protect a relief convoy. As the general pinned the medal to my chest, he said, "Harrington, you're one of the best I've ever seen." Those brief, sincere words were something I'd never heard from my father. But instead of pride, I felt a creeping sadness. I wanted my father to hear those words, to know I wasn't just a soldier settling for less. After the Middle East, I was called to the Pentagon as a policy advisor for the Air Force. It was a different world, no more cockpits or night flights, just long meetings with generals and politicians. I stood before Congress, briefing on air strategy in conflict zones, and was invited by the governor of South Carolina to high-level security conferences. Men in expensive suits shook my hand, calling me Colonel Harrington with a respect I never saw at home. But each time I returned to my small DC apartment, I felt empty. I had achieved things the 16-year-old me wouldn't have dared to dream. So why did I still feel like something was missing? While I poured sweat and blood into climbing the military ranks, I heard about my family through news articles and my mother's rare letters. James was now vice president of Landmark Holdings, praised by my father in every publication as the outstanding heir. Charlotte married a prominent lawyer living in a mansion in an affluent suburb. Evelyn, the youngest, became the company's communications director, hailed in magazines as a rising star in business. They lived in my father's spotlight, cherished like precious gems. Reading those articles, I didn't feel envy, but a vague ache. I didn't want their lives, but I wanted my father to look at me the way he looked at them. Just once. My mother was the only one who kept in touch. Her letters, written in soft handwriting, were brief but filled with love. She wrote about her quiet days in Charleston, her garden, and how she still kept the F-16 model I'd made her as a child. She never mentioned my father, and I never asked. But in one letter she wrote, "Adrian, I know you're doing great things. I only hope one day you'll find true joy." Those words left me wondering. I'd flown through war zones and stood before the nation's most powerful. But what was true joy? Recognition? Love? Or freedom from my family's shadow? When I was notified of my promotion to Major General, I was at the Pentagon in a small office overlooking the Potomac River. The appointment letter sat on my desk, the Air Force seal gleaming under the light. I opened it, reading it over and over as if to confirm it wasn't a dream. Major General. At 42. One of the youngest generals from South Carolina. But as I folded the letter, I didn't feel the joy I'd expected. Instead, there was an emptiness. I thought of my father, his words, and wondered if he'd change his mind if he knew. I wasn't sure. But one thing I did know. I wanted to face him, not to boast, but to show him how far I'd come without him. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was the governor. "Adrian, congratulations," his voice boomed through the speaker. "You're a pride of South Carolina. I want to invite you to Landmark Holdings Charity Gala next week. All the important people will be there. You have to come." I hesitated. A Landmark Gala, my father's domain, my family's world, a place where I was never welcome. But then I agreed, not for the glory, but because a thought flickered in my mind. Maybe this was my chance to change things, to show my father I wasn't the outcast. I decided to bring the appointment letter like a gift, a way to say, "Father, I did it." I didn't know that stepping into that gala would reopen an old wound in front of hundreds of eyes, and that my journey wasn't about seeking recognition but learning to let go. I stood before the mirror in my small DC apartment, adjusting my white dress shirt and dark suit. No uniform, no medals, no sign that I was an Air Force colonel, soon to be a major general. I wanted to walk into the gala as Adrian Harrington, not as a military symbol, but as a son returning after years of absence. In my jacket pocket, I carefully tucked the appointment letter, folded in a simple cream envelope. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was sweat, blood, sleepless nights at the academy, and missions through smoke-filled skies in the Middle East. It was proof that I had succeeded, even when my father never believed I could. The flight from DC to Charleston was short, but every minute felt like an hour. I gazed out the window, watching white clouds drift lazily, and wondered if I was making a mistake. 25 years ago, I left Charleston with a suitcase and a promise to myself, never to return. Now I was back, not out of homesickness, but with a fragile hope that my father might see me differently. I wasn't sure what I wanted from him, an apology, a nod, or just a look free of contempt. But I knew that if I didn't face him now, I'd carry the question forever. Would he ever be proud of me? As the plane landed, Charleston greeted me with the familiar humid heat of a South Carolina summer. I rented a car and drove to the convention center where the gala was held. The building was opulent, with marble columns and dazzling chandeliers embodying the extravagance Landmark Holdings always flaunted. I parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The crowd was already gathering. Sleek cars lined up. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns glided past, laughing and chatting. I felt out of place, like a stranger in my own hometown. Inside the hall, the air buzzed with music and light. Large banners displayed the Landmark Holdings logo with the words, "Charity Gala for the Community." Press, media, high-ranking officials. Everyone was there, as the governor had promised. I spotted James near a group of businessmen, his smug smile unchanged. Charlotte and Evelyn were in another corner, chatting with women in glittering dresses. My father, Edmund Harrington, stood at the center, tall and commanding, shaking hands like a king greeting his subjects. My mother stood beside him, her smile gentle but strained. I wasn't sure if she knew I'd be here. I chose a quiet corner near the bar where I could observe without drawing attention. A few people recognized me, nodding in greeting, but I responded briefly, not wanting to attract eyes. I was waiting for the right moment to approach my father, to hand him the appointment letter and say the words I'd rehearsed all week. "I did it, Father. I don't need your pride, but I want you to know." But as I repeated those words in my mind, a familiar voice interrupted. "Colonel Harrington, I didn't think you'd show up." The governor, in an elegant gray suit, approached with a wide smile. He shook my hand, his grip firm and warm. "You're one of the youngest generals this state has ever produced. I'm proud to have invited you here." "Thank you, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I just wanted to be here." "Just be here?" The governor laughed heartily. "You're too modest, Adrian. You're a pride of South Carolina, not just the Air Force. You should be up on that stage, letting people know what you've done." I gave a tight smile, shaking my head. "I'm not good with the spotlight, sir." He clapped my shoulder and pulled me toward a group of people. officials and businessmen I recognized from security conferences. They greeted me with respect, asking about my Middle East campaigns and my work at the Pentagon. I answered briefly, but my mind was on my father. He was there, not far away, yet his eyes hadn't once met mine. I wondered if he knew I was here or if he simply didn't care. When the program began, the MC took the stage, introducing Landmark Holdings' contributions to the community. Applause erupted, and my father stepped up to the podium. He wore a black tuxedo, his silver hair neatly combed, his voice deep and authoritative as he began his speech. He spoke of Landmark's legacy, skyscrapers, resorts, and charitable projects the company had funded. He mentioned James, Charlotte, and Evelyn, calling them worthy heirs and the pride of the Harrington family. The crowd clapped again, and a sharp pain stabbed my chest. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. The governor, standing beside me, leaned in. "Aren't you going up there, Adrian? Your father should know you're here." I shook my head, my voice low. "I'll talk to him later, sir." But then, like a sudden stab, my father's voice cut through the microphone, sharp and clear. "Tonight, I want to talk about my family. I'm proud of what we've built, of my children, James, Charlotte, Evelyn, who have brought glory to the Harrington name. But there's one child I don't want to see here tonight. He's a disgrace, a nobody who chose the path of a lowly soldier, sneaking in here to seek attention, to beg for favor from people like the governor." The hall fell into a stifling silence, as if the air had been sucked out. I stood there, just meters from the stage, feeling every eye in the vast room boring into me. No one needed to say my name. Everyone knew who he meant. The governor beside me froze, his mouth slightly open as if to protest. I saw my mother in the far corner clutch her chest, her eyes wide, searching for me in the crowd. James, Charlotte, and Evelyn glanced around, trying to spot me. But I didn't care about that. The sharp pain in my chest was drowning out reason. It wasn't the humiliation that hurt, it was the truth that after all these years my father still saw me as a stain on the family's reputation. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my heartbeat. Each of his words was a hammer blow, smashing into old memories. The nights I sat silently at the dinner table, the times I tried to share my dreams only to be met with a cold shake of his head. A lowly soldier, no future. Those words echoed in my mind, not just from his voice now, but from dozens of moments in the past. This time, though, it was different. I wasn't the 16-year-old boy sneaking aviation books in Mrs. Rosa's room. I no longer needed his approval. I was Adrian Harrington, Air Force Colonel, soon to be Major General, who had flown through battlefields and stood before Congress. And I would not let him define me again. I placed a hand on the governor's shoulder, shaking my head when he opened his mouth to speak. "No need, sir," I said, my voice low but firm. "Let me." He looked at me, surprised and concerned, but nodded and stepped back. I moved out of the shadows, feeling the hardwood floor beneath my feet, each step a silent declaration. The hall remained quiet, only the sound of my shoes echoing steady and clear. I didn't look at my father, the crowd, or the flashing cameras. I looked straight ahead where the stage lights awaited. As I stepped onto the platform, the MC quickly handed me the microphone, his eyes full of confusion. My father stood there, less than 2 meters away, his gaze icy, but I saw a flicker, perhaps surprise that I dared to appear. I held the microphone, feeling its weight in my hand, and for a moment I was back in the F-16 cockpit, preparing for a mission with no turning back. This wasn't a battlefield, but it was no less perilous. I knew what I said next would change everything, not just for my father, but for me. I took a breath and began, my voice slow but clear, resonating through the hall. Honor isn't something you can beg for, nor can it be bought. It's something you live to earn every day, through every choice, every action. I came here tonight not to seek attention, not to boast, but to offer a gift. Not to anyone else, but to this family. I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket, the Major General appointment letter tucked neatly inside. I placed it on the table in front of my father, gently, as if it were a letter from long ago, from the boy who once hoped to be seen. "This is my Major General appointment," I said, looking straight into his eyes for the first time that night. "I once thought one day you'd be proud, but today I just want you to know. I used to believe I was part of this family. Maybe I was wrong." The hall remained silent, but I felt a shift in the air, like a storm brewing. My father looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it. His lips pressed into a tight line, and I saw his hand tremble slightly. Not from emotion, but perhaps from anger or shame. I didn't wait for his response. I turned, walked off the stage, and headed straight for the door. No one stopped me. No one spoke. But as I pushed open the hall's doors, I heard whispers begin, like small waves before a tidal surge. I stepped outside, the cool Charleston night air enveloping me. I didn't look back, but I knew my father had opened the envelope. I knew he saw the Air Force seal, read the words confirming that I, the lowly soldier, was one of the youngest generals in the state at 42. I didn't need to stay to see his reaction. I didn't need an apology or recognition. In that moment, standing under a star-filled sky, I felt light, as if I'd finally shed a burden I'd carried for 25 years. I walked slowly to the rental car, the music from the hall still echoing faintly, distorted by the growing murmur of voices. I didn't need to stay to know what was happening. I could imagine it. My father's expression, perhaps stunned, perhaps enraged, as he realized the son he'd just humiliated in front of hundreds wasn't just a lowly soldier, but someone even the governor respected. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the glittering lights of the convention center behind. But deep down, I knew the story didn't end when I left. The storm had begun, and it would sweep Landmark Holdings and my father into its eye. Inside the hall, the silence I left behind quickly shattered. I wasn't there to witness it, but those present later recounted the scene through phone calls, messages, and the articles that appeared the next morning. As I walked out the door, the governor stepped onto the stage, his face hardened, no longer bearing the friendly smile he'd given me earlier. He took the microphone, his voice low but cutting, like a blade slicing through the stifling air. "I came here tonight hoping to witness the generosity and humanity of Landmark Holdings," he said. "But what I've just seen is an unacceptable insult to a man who has served this country with courage and honor. Perhaps I was mistaken about the values this family represents." He spoke decisively and left the stage immediately after. The murmurs began to spread like flames licking through a dry field. Guests, from donors to high-ranking officials, exchanged bewildered glances. Some stood quietly, leaving their tables as if unwilling to remain tied to an event tainted by my father's words. A CEO from a major investment fund, whom I recognized from security conferences, stood and spoke loudly enough for the hall to hear. "We don't do business with people who disgrace our nation's heroes." He walked out, his entourage following, leaving empty tables and stunned gazes in their wake. The reporters, always quick to catch the scent of drama, scribbled frantically. Cameras flashed, capturing my father standing on the stage, still holding the envelope I'd left, his face pale, stripped of the commanding presence he'd had at the start of his speech. My mother, in the far corner, bowed her head, her hands clenched as if trying to hold back pain. James, Charlotte, and Evelyn stood nearby, frozen like puppets with their strings cut. They didn't know what to do or say, and perhaps for the first time in their lives, they felt the Harrington family's spotlight no longer shielded them. Another major donor, who had pledged millions to Landmark's charity project, stood and left without a word. Others followed, and soon the hall became a scene of chaos. Whispers turned into arguments, polite handshakes became cold stares. A reporter from the Charleston Post later told me he overheard a city official say to a colleague, "Edmund Harrington just shot himself in the foot. Who insults a general in front of the governor?" Another responded, "Landmark Holdings will pay dearly for this." And they were right. The next morning, as I sat in my hotel room sipping coffee and looking out over Charleston's streets, my phone buzzed incessantly. Messages poured in from old friends, colleagues at the Pentagon, even reporters I'd met. Headlines on online news outlets began to appear. Billionaire mogul humiliates war hero son at charity gala. Another bolder read, Edmund Harrington calls son a lowly soldier, unaware he's the state's youngest major general. Each headline was a knife not into me but into the empire my father had spent his life building. I didn't read all the articles, I didn't need to. I knew what happened last night wasn't just a moment of embarrassment for my father. It was a crack in the perfect facade of Landmark Holdings that could never be repaired. Partners pulled out, donors canceled pledges, and social media spread the story at lightning speed. A video secretly recorded on a guest's phone surfaced on YouTube, capturing the moment I placed the envelope before my father and walked away. The caption read, "This is how a soldier responds to humiliation, with honor and silence." The post was shared thousands of times, accompanied by comments calling my father arrogant and me a quiet hero. That day, Landmark Holdings stock began to plummet. An article in the Wall Street Journal analyzed how the scandal at the gala had shaken investor confidence, once viewing Landmark as a symbol of stability. Edmund Harrington's arrogance has put the company in a precarious position, the article stated. Insulting a military general, especially his own son, in front of officials and partners is an irreparable mistake. Major partners, from investment funds to real estate development firms, began withdrawing from projects signed with Landmark. A real estate conglomerate in Atlanta, which had committed to a $100 million resort project, announced the cancellation of their contract, citing differences in ethical values. The Landmark Holdings board, typically subservient to my father, started to speak out. I heard that an emergency meeting was held the day after the gala, and for the first time in the company's history, they demanded my father consider stepping down as chairman. "We cannot let the entire company pay the price for a thoughtless moment," a board member's statement leaked from an internal email declared. My father, who had always prided himself on building Landmark from nothing, must have felt betrayed. But he had no one to blame but himself. Within the family, the chaos was even more pronounced. James, my older brother and my father's right-hand man, tried to salvage the situation by appearing on a local TV program. He spouted platitudes about misunderstandings and complex family dynamics, but no one bought it. The public, already inflamed on social media, labeled him a hypocrite and cowardly heir. Charlotte and Evelyn, my father's darling daughters, stayed silent. They didn't speak to the press or post anything on X. I could imagine them in their luxurious apartments, quietly reading the scathing comments about our family, unsure of what to do as the spotlight they'd relied on began to fade. My mother was the only one who reached out to me. That morning, she sent a brief message. "Adrian, I'm sorry. I'm proud of you, always have been." I stared at the message, feeling a pang of pain. Not anger toward her, but sorrow knowing she was caught between her love for me and her loyalty to my father. I replied, "Thank you, Mom. I'm okay." And I was, not because I'd won, but because I'd walked away with my dignity intact. But I knew she wasn't okay. She was the woman who had always tried to hold our family together, and now she was watching it fracture from within. A friend working at Landmark Holdings told me he saw my father in his office looking as if he'd aged 10 years overnight. "He kept staring at your appointment letter," my friend said, "like he couldn't believe it was real." I wasn't surprised. My father had always viewed me through a lens of disappointment, and now, faced with the truth, he couldn't accept that his lowly soldier had surpassed anything he'd ever imagined. But the truth didn't change him. Instead of admitting his mistake, he lashed out at everyone around him. He blamed James for not stopping his speech, Charlotte and Evelyn for not supporting the family during the crisis, even my mother for spoiling me as a child. I learned that my father called a family meeting right after the gala, shouting at my siblings in a closed boardroom. "You let me shoot myself in the foot," he yelled, as if they were the ones who stood on that stage and spoke those words. But James, Charlotte, and Evelyn just bowed their heads. They'd spent their lives under his shadow, relying on his wealth and reputation, and they didn't dare push back. As Landmark sank into crisis, I prepared to leave Charleston for D.C. I didn't feel triumphant or gleeful knowing my father was paying a price. I felt only a strange emptiness. I had once dreamed of the day he'd look at me with pride, but now I realized it no longer mattered. My father could lose his reputation, his partners, the public's respect. But I had found something he could never take away: my self-respect. As I packed my suitcase, I suddenly thought I should write a letter to my father. Not to blame him, but to close this chapter. I wanted him to understand that no matter how hard he tried, he could no longer define me. I wanted him to know I was no longer the boy standing in the corner of the house waiting for a glance from him. I had come too far to need that anymore. I picked up a pen, took a deep breath, and began to write. My handwriting was slow, each word like a careful step on a path I'd walked my entire life. Dear Father, you once said that a person's worth is measured by numbers, revenue, profits, the skyscrapers you built. You've lived your life proving that, and perhaps for you that's the truth. But for me, worth isn't found in things that can be counted. It lies in how people remember you when you're gone, in what you leave in the hearts of others. I once hoped that one day you'd look at me and see something worth being proud of. I thought that if I tried hard enough, flew high enough, earned enough medals, you'd stop calling me a lowly soldier. But last night at the gala, I realized I no longer need you to do that. I don't need your forgiveness because I have nothing to apologize for. I just want you to know that I once believed I was part of this family, even though this family never truly had a place for me. I'm not writing this letter to blame you. I'm writing to say goodbye, not to you, but to the years I spent trying to earn your recognition. I've found my path, not in the opulent offices of Landmark, but in the sky, in the nights I flew through battlefields, in the moments I knew I'd saved lives. That's my worth, and no one, not even you, can take that away. I hope one day you'll understand what self-respect truly means. Not standing at the top looking down, but standing tall, even when no one applauds. I don't expect you to change because I know you won't. But I hope just once you'll look back and ask yourself if you were right to push me out of your life. Your son, Adrian. I folded the letter and placed it in a plain white envelope. No seal, no embellishments. I wrote the address of the Charleston house, knowing my mother would receive it first. I wasn't sure if my father would read it or tear it apart the moment he saw my name, but that didn't matter anymore. This letter wasn't a plea or an accusation, it was a declaration that I had found myself and I didn't need his validation to keep moving forward. I left the hotel and took the envelope to the nearest post office. When I handed it to the clerk, a young woman with a friendly smile, she asked, "Anything important in here, sir?" I smiled and shook my head. "Just a letter," I said. But inside I knew it was more. It was how I closed 26 years of wounds, hopes, and unfulfilled dreams. On the drive back to DC, I passed through Charleston's familiar streets, the ones I'd run through as a boy dreaming of airplanes. I saw the silhouette of the family's grand house in the rearview mirror, but I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The letter had spoken for me, and now I could leave Charleston, my family, and my father behind. At the airport, my phone buzzed, a message from a Pentagon colleague. "Adrian, you okay? The whole world's talking about you." I didn't reply right away. I looked out the window, watching a plane take off, leaving a white streak across the sky. I smiled. The world could say what it wanted, but I knew who I was, and that was all that mattered. Later I learned that when the letter reached my father, he sat alone in his office, reading it in silence. He didn't shout or tear it up as I'd imagined. He simply folded it, placed it in his desk drawer, and closed it. I don't know what he felt, shame, regret, or just emptiness. But I didn't need to know. The letter wasn't meant to change him. It was meant to set me free. In the days that followed, I heard that Landmark Holdings continued to face turmoil. Articles kept appearing, but I stopped reading them. I didn't need to know more about the collapse of the empire my father had built. I only knew that while he struggled to save his reputation, I was beginning a new chapter. One no longer haunted by the Harrington family's shadow. I returned to DC, preparing for my official Major General promotion ceremony. I thought of my mother, her letters, and how she'd always believed in me, even if she never said so in front of my father. I thought of Mrs. Rosa, who told me my heart belonged to the sky. And I thought of myself, the boy who once stood under Charleston's stars, dreaming of the day he'd fly. I had flown not just through the sky, but through pain, doubt, and insults, and now I was free. DC welcomed me with the crisp chill of autumn, its streets lined with oak trees and pale sunlight spilling across the sidewalks. I returned to my small apartment devoid of Persian rugs or crystal chandeliers. Just a bookshelf filled with aviation manuals and a framed photo of me in an F-16 cockpit, a rare smile on my face. I set down my suitcase, opened the window, and let the fresh air flood in. Charleston, with all that happened at the gala, now felt like a distant memory, like a dream I'd woken from. The letter I sent to my father, those final words I wrote to him, had closed a long chapter of my life. I no longer waited for his reply, no longer hoped for a nod or a proud glance. I had found freedom, not in his recognition, but in realizing I didn't need it. The Major General promotion ceremony was held in a modest hall at Andrews Air Force Base, far from the grandeur of Charleston's galas. No press, no flashing cameras, just colleagues, soldiers, and people who truly understood the meaning of the silver star on my shoulder. When the presiding general pinned the rank to my uniform, he shook my hand and said, "Adrian, you've made us proud." Those simple, sincere words touched me more deeply than any praise from my father ever could. I looked around the hall, seeing the faces of those who'd flown with me through battlefields, who'd seen me fail and rise again, and I knew this was my true family, not bound by blood but by the values we shared. After the ceremony, I received a letter from my mother. She didn't mention my father, the gala, or the turmoil at Landmark Holdings. She wrote only about her garden, the blooming azaleas, and how she kept the F-16 model I'd made her as a child on her desk. "You are my light, Adrian," she wrote. "Wherever you go, I'm here." Reading her words, I felt a warmth seep into my heart. I texted her back, just a few lines. "I love you, Mom. I'll visit soon." I didn't promise when, but I knew I'd keep my word, not for Charleston, but for her. I decided to relocate near the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, where my journey began. I was invited to serve as an honorary advisor, sharing my experiences with young cadets who carried the same dreams I once had. Standing before them in the familiar lecture hall, its walls adorned with photos of legendary pilots, I saw myself in their eyes, boys and girls brimming with passion, ready to face any challenge to reach the sky. I told them about my early struggles, the nights I doubted myself, and how I learned that honor doesn't come from medals but from never giving up. One afternoon, as I walked across the academy's campus, a young cadet ran up, breathless. "Colonel Whitaker, General, I read about your story online," he said, eyes shining. "The way you faced your family, it inspired me." I smiled, clapped his shoulder. "Just call me Adrian," I said. "And if there's one thing to learn, it's this. Don't let anyone define who you are. Only you know where you belong." The story of the Charleston Gala lingered, not just on social media but in conversations at the Pentagon. Some colleagues called me a quiet hero, but I didn't care for the title. I wasn't a hero and I wasn't quiet. I was just a man who chose to live true to himself, even if it meant walking alone. Articles about Landmark Holdings kept appearing, detailing how the company's stock still hadn't recovered, how my father had to cede the chairman's seat to James in a desperate bid to salvage its reputation. I didn't follow closely, but I heard my father appeared less in public, and when he did, he never mentioned me or the gala. Perhaps he'd learned to stay silent, as I once had. I don't know if he reread my letter or ever reflected on what I wrote. Part of me hoped he would, but a larger part no longer cared. I'd spent too many years waiting for something I couldn't control. Now I just wanted to live, not to prove anything, but to savor the days I could still fly, still stand under the sky and feel I belonged to it. One night, sitting on the balcony of my new apartment in Colorado Springs, gazing at the twinkling stars above the Rocky Mountains, I thought of young Adrian, the boy who lay on the grass in Charleston dreaming of flight. That boy had come a long way, not just through skies filled with smoke, but through pain and doubt. He'd learned that sometimes to be seen you have to go far, not for others to notice you, but to stop being seen wrong. I sipped my coffee, feeling the sharp Colorado chill. My phone buzzed, a message from my mother with a photo of her garden vibrant with azaleas. "Thinking of you," she wrote. I smiled, replying, "Thinking of you too." Then I looked up at the sky, where a plane left a faint streak of light. I didn't need to be up there to know I belonged to it. I'd found freedom, not in escaping my father's shadow, but in realizing it had never truly defined me. My story closes not with a triumphant victory or a perfect ending, but with peace. Some sons must go far, not to be seen, but to stop being seen wrong. And I, Adrian Harrington, had found my path, not under the spotlight of landmark holdings, but beneath the vast sky, where I'd always belonged.